Yuki's plan in motion. In the shadows of a world now teetering on the brink of a new era, Yuki Kagerizaka's mind worked tirelessly. The charismatic yet dangerous mastermind, once an otherworlder hailed as a hero, now moved like a puppeteer behind the scenes. After Clayman's downfall, the balance among the demon lords shifted, and Yuki was quick to exploit the vacuum left behind. To the public, Yuki remained the leader of the Freedom Association, a supposed champion of peace and exploration. But beneath that polished surface lay the ambitions of a man determined to reshape the world according to his own vision. Using his network of informants, assassins, and loyal agents, he began pulling the strings of his next operation: the infiltration of Tempest's ever-growing labyrinth. The labyrinth, Ramrus's massive dungeon, had grown into more than just a tourist attraction or adventurer's paradise. It was now a vital asset to the nation of Tempest, serving both economic and military functions. And that made it a prime target. Yuki knew that a direct attack on Rimuru would be reckless. Rimuru was no longer just a powerful slime or even merely a demon lord. He was a king, a symbol, and a strategic genius backed by powerful allies like Veldora and Diablo. So Yuki opted for a subtler path: infiltration and subversion. He sent a select group of skilled fighters into the dungeon, each chosen not just for power, but for cunning. Some were remnants of Clayman's forces, those who had escaped the collapse of their master's domain. Others were mercenaries and warriors Yuki had gathered under false pretenses, offering them riches, freedom, or vengeance. But all of them were pawns on a board only Yuki fully understood. Among these operatives were characters cloaked in mystery, beings with strange magic, unusual skills, and unwavering loyalty to Yuki. Their mission wasn't simply to defeat dungeon bosses or retrieve treasure. It was reconnaissance, sabotage, and disruption. If they could find weaknesses in the labyrinth structure or in its management, those vulnerabilities could be exploited later on. Yuki's true genius, however, lay not in brute strength but in manipulation. Even those who served him often didn't realize the full scope of his plans. He sowed seeds of conflict not just to weaken enemies, but to force them to make moves they weren't ready for. Chaos was his ally, and the Dungeon of Tempest was about to feel its touch. As the infiltrators began their descent into the dungeon's depths, Yuki watched from afar, every move calculated. He didn't expect all of them to survive, but survival wasn't the goal. Disruption was. Confusion. Fear. A message to Rimuru: even within your walls, you are not untouchable. Unbeknownst to the people of Tempest, the first pieces of Yuki's next great game were already moving. And with every step, the storm drew closer. Dungeon as a strategic front. The labyrinth, once a chaotic playground conjured by the whimsical demon lord Ramrus, had transformed into one of the most important pillars of Tempest's defense and economy. What started as a bizarre idea had blossomed into a symbol of innovation, strength, and strategy. Within its twisting floors, Tempest had found not only a source of wealth but a new kind of battlefield, one they could completely control. The core of the labyrinth's uniqueness lay in its structure. Unlike typical dungeons of the world, this one was alive with magic, built with care, reinforced by divine-level abilities, and overseen by powerful beings like Veldora and Ramrus themselves. It could respawn monsters, reset traps, and reconstruct rooms after each challenge. Adventurers could enter, die, and return again, safe, healed, and even stronger. It was entertainment, training, and warfare all in one. Rimuru, always the strategist, had recognized its potential immediately. Rather than keeping it as a novelty for thrill-seekers, he pushed for it to be turned into a national asset. The floors were expanded. Guardians were stationed. Resource management systems were built. Magical surveillance ensured that nothing happened within the dungeon without Rimuru knowing. Ramrus, despite her chaotic personality, embraced her role as dungeon master. With Veldora acting like an overexcited game designer, the two infused the labyrinth with both danger and flair. Some levels were filled with monsters that challenged even high-ranked adventurers. Others were puzzles, mazes, or traps that demanded intelligence and teamwork. And deep in the lowest levels, the true terrors lurked, bosses like Zijin and Testarossa, whose powers rivaled nations. The labyrinth became a training ground not only for Tempest's own warriors but also a lure for outsiders. Adventurers from all corners of the world came, drawn by rumors of legendary weapons and untold riches. Merchants followed, bringing their trade and their gold. Slowly, a bustling economy formed around the dungeon. Hotels, shops, restaurants, all thriving under Rimuru's careful watch. But this strategic brilliance came with a risk. The dungeon was also a door into the very heart of Tempest. And Yūki knew this. For Rimuru, the dungeon was a fortress that grew stronger with each intruder. For Yūki, it was an opening, one that could be exploited from within. Unlike cities guarded by walls and armies, the labyrinth welcomed people in. Anyone strong or lucky enough could reach its depths. And if they were clever enough, they might find ways to bypass its defenses. Despite the many magical barriers and patrols, Rimuru couldn't completely seal off the dungeon without destroying its value. That was the gamble. He counted on the labyrinth's regenerative systems, its loyal guardians, and his own divine-level analysis through Raphael to catch threats before they could grow. Still, he was cautious. Under his orders, the dungeon's security protocols had been enhanced. Labyrinth guardians like Gabble, Geld, and others rotated patrols in secret. Raphael constantly scanned the dungeon's energy signatures. Suspicious adventurers were flagged for observation, and floors were subtly altered in real time to trap or slow those who moved with unnatural intent. Rimuru also had another plan, to use the dungeon as a kind of litmus test. Those who entered might reveal their strength, their true goals, and even their affiliations. By watching how they fought, how they moved, and where they went, Tempest could gather intelligence silently and effectively. The dungeon had become more than stone and magic. It was a living part of Tempest's strategy. To the people, it was a marvel. To Rimuru, it was a weapon. And to Yūki, it was a challenge. Intruders enter the dungeon. Though the dungeon had become a prized jewel of Tempest, its walls brimming with magic, its economy booming with foreign adventurers, and its layers guarded by formidable warriors, it was never meant to be impenetrable. In fact, its very nature invited chaos. And now, chaos was arriving in disguise. Among the steady flow of adventurers eager to test their skills, earn fame, or chase fortune, a darker tide had begun to seep in, Yūki's infiltrators. Cloaked in false identities and masked intentions, these individuals blended seamlessly with the crowd. On the surface, they looked like thrill-seekers or mercenaries, but their movements were precise, their conversations sparse, and their eyes filled with something colder than greed, purpose. Some came alone, others in tight-knit teams. They didn't storm the dungeon. They slithered into it, unnoticed. Like venom in the bloodstream, they moved floor by floor, learning the dungeon's patterns, testing its traps, probing for weak points. They recorded layouts in their minds, whispered to enchanted scrolls, and sent back fragments of information through hidden magic channels. These were not ordinary adventurers. They were tacticians, spies, assassins, and they had been trained to dismantle structures from the inside. Many of them were survivors of Clayman's forces, hardened by loss and now fueled by vengeance. Others were loyal to Yuki's twisted ideology, believing in his vision of reshaping the world through manipulation and force. Still others had been bought with promises of power or redemption. Whatever their reasons, they shared a single goal: destabilize Tempest, beginning with its most vulnerable front, the open gates of the labyrinth. But what they did not expect was how alive the dungeon truly was. Within the labyrinth, every step was watched. Though Rimuru rarely appeared in person, his presence was felt in every corner. Through the eyes of magical constructs and the mind of Raphael, he saw everything. His elite guardians, Gabble, Geld, Zijin, and others, roamed the halls like spirits, appearing when least expected, vanishing just as quickly. Each was more than a match for any single intruder. They were evolved beings, blessed by Rimuru and sharpened by experience. Still, the enemy was clever. They avoided direct confrontation when possible. Instead, they studied the guards, noted their patterns, and targeted the less obvious vulnerabilities. Magical relay points, support systems, monster respawn cores. They didn't need to destroy the dungeon. They only needed to interrupt its rhythm, to sow doubt, to weaken morale. If they could make the dungeon unreliable, adventurers would stop coming. Trade would slow. Trust in Tempest's safety would waver. And so began a silent war. Some infiltrators succeeded in their early objectives, sabotaging monster spawns, triggering traps remotely, and even vanishing entire storage caches deep within hidden rooms. Others were not so lucky. One squad vanished after stepping onto a newly rerouted floor. Another encountered a creature so powerful it didn't even speak. It simply moved, and they ceased to exist. Those who escaped often returned terrified, whispering about monsters who could think, floors that changed while you walked, and death that came without warning. Among the defenders, there was no panic, only precision. Gabble coordinated floor security with military discipline. Geld handled emergency repairs with speed and strength, and Zijin hunted. Silent and merciless, Zijin took special interest in the intruders. Not for revenge, but to protect Rimuru's dream. He moved through shadows, stalked magic signatures, and engaged only when certain. Those who met him rarely lived to speak about it. Back in Tempest's command center, Rimuru observed without intervening directly. He trusted his people. Raphael provided constant updates, adjusting dungeon layouts in real time, even whispering small traps into existence where needed. The dungeon was evolving, learning, adapting. Every failed intrusion made it stronger. But Rimuru understood one thing clearly. These weren't random incidents. This was a test, an opening move in a larger game. Yūki was watching. He was waiting to see how far he could go before being noticed. And Rimuru? He was letting the game play out, for now. Tempest's internal developments. While the labyrinth bristled with silent tension and unseen battles, the city of Tempest itself remained a portrait of calm progress. To the average citizen, life was peaceful, prosperous even. Streets were alive with trade, diplomacy flourished with distant nations, and the once savage Jura forest had transformed into a beacon of unity and hope. But beneath the surface, Rimuru was preparing for a storm. Rimuru Tempest, the once ordinary slime turned demon lord, never allowed himself the illusion of peace. Though his people lived comfortably, his mind remained fixed on the bigger picture: defense, growth, and sustainability. He understood that Tempest had grown too important, too powerful, and too central to the world stage to avoid becoming a target. And so, while the world watched the surface, Rimuru worked from the shadows, crafting plans far more intricate than anyone could see. The heart of these developments pulsed within the labyrinth. Rimuru, through the angelic intellect of Raphael, began automating the dungeon's deeper systems. What had once required Ramorus's direct supervision could now function under advanced magical algorithms. Respawn rates, environmental settings, difficulty modulation, all of it was monitored and optimized in real time. Raphael became not only a partner, but the dungeon's silent overseer, adjusting threats, analyzing intruder behavior, and preemptively creating countermeasures. Outside the dungeon, Tempest's infrastructure expanded at remarkable speed. Trade routes with human and monster nations were reinforced. Diplomatic relations strengthened, especially with allies like Dworgen and Blumend. The nation's military, once a ragtag mix of goblins and wolves, now stood as a structured force of evolved monsters, each trained and ranked. Geld worked tirelessly to lead reconstruction and logistics, while Benimaru refined the army's strategy and readiness. Meanwhile, Rimuru continued to evolve his command style. No longer just a leader who relied on brute strength, he delegated more and more responsibility to those he trusted: Diablo, Shuna, Soai, Cheyenne, and others. This network of loyal and capable subordinates allowed Rimuru to focus on the grander design, shaping Tempest into a self-sustaining empire. Not one ruled through fear, but one built on respect, diplomacy, and intelligent power. In this phase of development, knowledge became a weapon. Rimuru prioritized intelligence gathering, both magical and political. Raphael scoured magical networks for unusual activity. Soai's spies operated deep within hostile territories, and adventurers who visited the labyrinth were subtly monitored, not just for security, but for insight into shifting tides among the Western nations. Rimuru also invested in education and technology. Schools for young monsters and humans alike began teaching language, magic theory, crafting techniques, and even economics. The goal was simple: elevate Tempest beyond a powerful nation, make it a civilized superpower. The labyrinth would remain its shield, but knowledge would be its sword. Of course, all of this required balance. And so Rimuru paid close attention to his people's morale. Festivals were planned. Citizens were heard. Even with the growing tension from outside threats, he ensured Tempest never slipped into paranoia. The people believed in him, and he would not betray that trust by ruling through fear or secrecy. Yet even as the city thrived and the dungeon evolved, Rimuru never forgot the bigger picture. The signs were clear. A shadow moved in the world, and its name was Yūki. His schemes were spreading, and though the intrusions into the labyrinth had yet to escalate into open war, Rimuru felt the tremors of something far more dangerous than a simple infiltration. Still, he did not panic. Tempest would be ready not just with force, but with unity, knowledge, and purpose. Because Rimuru didn't just want to defend his people. He wanted to protect their future. Hints of larger conflicts. Though much of the world remained unaware, something vast and inevitable was stirring beneath the surface. Whispers rode the wind, drifting from royal courts to slums, from merchant caravans to war camps. Even among the most isolated corners of the world, one truth became harder to ignore. The balance of power was shifting, and it was about to break. The demon lords, once gods of fear and chaos, had begun to reorganize. With Clayman's fall and Rimuru's rise, the 10 great demon lords were no longer what they once were. Their very name had changed. Now they were the Octagram, a new council with Rimuru among its youngest and most unpredictable members. To the world, this restructuring was a curiosity. But to the sharp-eyed and power-hungry, it was a signal. A new era had begun, and the rules were no longer the same. In the Western Nations Council, an alliance of human-led countries seeking to protect themselves from monsters and demon lords, anxiety ran high. Tempest had gone from a curious new nation to a dominant force with military, magical, and economic influence. Rimuru, who once seemed approachable, now stood beside beings like Guy Crimson and Malim Nava. Was he still a friend, or had he become something far beyond their reach? Some political factions called for diplomacy. Others whispered of containment strategies, espionage, even war. But they all agreed on one thing: Tempest could no longer be ignored. Meanwhile, among Rimuru's allies, there was unease as well, not because of doubt, but because they too saw the storm coming. Diablo, ever devoted but ever vigilant, quietly hunted for traces of deeper conspiracies. Soai's network picked up irregularities. Sudden mercenary movements, vanished villages, strange disappearances of magical beasts. Patterns were forming, but the full picture remained unclear. Back in the shadows, Yūki Kagerizaka continued to weave his web. His goals were still hidden, even to those who served him. But his actions betrayed the shape of something much larger than simple revenge or domination. He wasn't attacking Tempest alone. He was maneuvering the entire world, aligning enemies, seeding chaos, destabilizing old powers. In doing so, he hoped to create a vacuum. And into that vacuum he would step. The infiltration of the labyrinth was just a fragment of the greater scheme. His agents were not just in Tempest, but in human nations, among guilds, in trading companies, and even within the shadows of some demon lords' territories. He had no loyalty to race or creed. He believed only in one thing: control. What Yūki sought was not simply victory, but the collapse of the old order. And in that collapse, Rimuru stood in his way. Back in Tempest, Rimuru sensed this not fully, not clearly, but deeply. His instincts, sharpened by battle and guided by Raphael's analytical brilliance, screamed that this was not the end. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous than open war. This was a conflict of ideologies, of freedom against manipulation, of creation against destruction. So he waited, Not in fear but in focus. Allies were being gathered, systems strengthened, secrets uncovered. And somewhere, far from the bright city lights and cheers of adventurers, Rimuru began to plan for a different kind of battle. One fought not just with swords or magic, but with will, wisdom, and vision. Because the future was no longer just about survival. It was about shaping the world to come.